October the 14th, 1939 was a very dark, moonlit night, quiet but with a few stars, when Kapitan Gunther Prien, commander of the U-boat U-47, finally managed to negotiate his submarine into Scapa Flow. He had had some difficulty in negotiating Kirk Sound, the main entrance available to the flow, inasmuch that the submarine became ensnared on a cable ship of one of the two block ships within Kirk Sound, and he had to put his engines racing into reverse to ensure that the submarine extricated itself from a cable chain. Had he not, he would never have been able to get into Scapa Flow and carry out his mission, which was to sink as many warships as he could find. It was more or less a suicide mission, and Prien had already said this to his crew. They all knew that they would probably never get out, if indeed they would ever get in. As Prien negotiated Kirk Sound on the surface and entered into Scapa Flow, he was surprised to see that there were no warships whatsoever in his sights. He continued to wander around the southern part of Scapa Flow and could see nothing. He decided to change course and steered the submarine towards the north part of Scapa Flow, where, to his astonishment, suddenly out of the darkness appeared the silhouette of a battleship. The battleship was Royal Oak. He was both surprised and delighted that he had come upon this massive battleship, one of the largest in the Royal Navy. Immediately he put the crew into action station mode. Torpedoes were ready, and he decided to fire the first salvo from about half a mile from the warship. The order to loose was given, and the torpedoes sped towards the target. The running time was approximately 3 minutes. One of those 3 torpedoes hit the front of the Royal Oak in the bow, starting a small fire in an inflammable store. It then hit an anchor chain, bounced off and disappeared without fully exploding. The other 2 torpedoes disappeared without trace, and to this day they have never been found. As soon as Prien knew that he had missed his target, he decided to turn the submarine through 180 degrees, pointing the stern at the battleship, and tried to fire the one and only tube that is in any submarine at the stern. Unfortunately for him, the torpedo did not fire. So Prien by this time was getting angry, and he decided yet again, bearing in mind he was still on the surface, to maneuver the submarine to face it with bows towards the battleship, and fired 3 further torpedoes. Running time approximately 3 minutes, distance of firing approximately half a mile. And within that period all 3 torpedoes smashed into the battleship amidships. Prien by this time knew that the battleship was doomed. The type of torpedoes used for this mission were the electrically driven magnetic type impact, which meant that these type of torpedoes didn't explode right on impact, but they penetrated whatever they were aimed at to quite a depth before they exploded. Consequently, when these 3 torpedoes exploded, they were right in the middle of the battleship amidships, and the battleship rose with the force of the internal explosion. The last salvo struck the battleship amidships and caused an enormous amount of damage, and Prien was quite right when he knew that the battleship was doomed. Within a few minutes she began to list. Within 10 minutes she was gone to the seabed. in about 100 feet of water. This gave the crew of 1,200 men very little time to react to anything. They did not even realise, and the officers on board the ship didn't realise, that they had been torpedoed. And this took some time after the sinking to come out in the Board of Inquiry that indeed she had been torpedoed and that her sinking was not due to some other cause, maybe even sabotage. Gunther Prien had sunk one of the largest battleships within the Royal Navy. Few people realise that she was 600 feet long from stern to bow, 100 feet wide amidships, and needed a crew of 1,200 to sail her. She had two 42,000 horsepower oil-fuelled engines which propelled her to a top speed of 20 knots. It is hard to realise how a battleship weighing 30,000 tons sank to the seabed within such a short period of time, approximately 10 minutes. As Prien negotiated himself a U-47 out of Scapa Flow, all that he had left behind were screaming men desperately trying to swim in a sea covered with oil within a temperature of 45 degrees Fahrenheit, which is enough to chill the human body to the bone within 5 minutes. In fact, the oil that they became covered in helped to insulate them a little bit from the cold, but nevertheless they were desperately fighting for their lives. Prien had caused mayhem, death and destruction. In 1941, Prien met his demise together with his crew when his submarine U-47 was sunk by HMS Wolverine, a British destroyer, who heavily damaged the submarine's propulsion mechanism, so that every time Prien tried to race his engines, it was heard up above by the destroyer. He nevertheless endeavoured to reach keel, and all this time the submarine was taking on water until finally he was off Iceland and the submarine sank in very deep water, far too deep to form any salvage at some later date. After the sinking in 1940, Churchill ordered that the various gaps around Scapa Flow should be sealed. Balfour Beatty became the appointed contractors, and they were constructed using 5-ton and 10-ton blocks of concrete, quite huge. The total barrier area, in fact, weighed 64,000 tons. To carry out this mammoth task, they used a lot of Italian prisoners of war as labourers. By 1942, they were sufficiently high to ensure that never again would any submarine be able to penetrate Scapa Flow. By 1944, they were complete, and on the top of these barriers they built roads known as the causeways, which connected all the various islands around Scapa Flow to road traffic. The sinking of the Royal Oak incurred the greatest loss of boy life in living naval history. Of 162 boys that were actually on board, 120 lost their lives. Only 23 lived out their lives to the end of the war. This was such a tragedy that immediately after the sinking, in Parliament, Dr. Edith Scomersill put forward a suggestion that, in her opinion, this should never be allowed to take place again. She put forward a motion to Churchill, then Lord of the Admiralty, that boys should never again be allowed to serve on a warship in wartime. Churchill on the other hand, responded by saying, no, we have always had boys in the Royal Navy. I see no reason why this tragedy should change matters. Dr. Edith Summersgill is reported as saying, no, it just must not be allowed to happen again. And Churchill reluctantly had to concede that perhaps it might be a good idea, as far as the general public were concerned, to have the law changed, and it was changed, and it is still in place to this day, whereby to join the Royal Navy at under the age of 17 requires either special parental permission or a special circumstance before this can happen.